Well, good evening, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you this evening. Sorry, change that. The archaeology usually focuses on a narrow range. Oh dear, something's beaming. Of particular sites or particular objects or group of objects. But tonight, I'd like to look instead at the interplay of people, geography, events, climates, and ideas within a defined geographic area. So the first thing we need to do, of course, is to define the area. Now, if you look at the map and take a mental walk, start in Keighley and go northwards till you hit Wharfdale, follow Wharfdale up to Hubberholm. Sorry, am I not speaking loud enough?
No, it's my hearing.
Right.
I'm having problems with the hearing system. I've only got one working ear.
Yeah. Right, sorry. So up to Hubberholm, and then northwestwards along Langstrathdale, over the bit of high ground till you come to Ribblesdale, and then follow Ribblesdale all the way down till you get to Clitheroe, or if you like, to Grindleton that we'll be speaking of, and then eastwards back to Keighley. You've made a nice circuit of the land. It actually is, encompasses the ancient wapentake of Staincliffe. And it's a coherent geographic area, as you can see from this map. It's almost surrounded by high ground. It contains the heads of 3 important rivers, with roughly similar climates between them, though certainly allied. It's somewhat isolated from wider surrounds, except of course that it has the air gap and the important, at many periods in history, east-west route that goes through from York to Lancaster by way of the Wenning River. And it was defined as a political geographic area, of course, by Danelaw, and so that's more than 1,000 years ago. Now, in almost the center of this area we defined is the very small village, has always been very small, of Ayrton, or Ayrton and Scothrop, if you like to distinguish between the two of them. The map that I'm showing you is an 18th century one that was used by traveling preachers, but in fact, the roads on that map are the same as they've been for hundreds of years previously. And what it shows very clearly is that Ayrton is central to an area, but it's self-isolated. There are no villages or settlements very close to it, but it's equidistant from quite a number of other more important places, and there are many routes going to and from Ayrton. Now, this business of having easy access from multiple directions, but not many people around, either as you're traveling or when you get to Ayrton, made it a particularly good place for people to meet if they didn't want to be observed. There wouldn't be many people around to see you coming or going, and once you got into Ayrton, there wouldn't be many people there to see you. So this turns out to have been significant at one period. Now, almost in the center of Ayrton is the Ayrton Meeting House. When it was built, it was on the edge of the village, in a field by itself, but it's now near the center. And at first sight, this building looks like exactly what it is, an early 17th century construction that had its roof raised and its windows enlarged in 1710. But it has several unusual features, and the most unusual of all is that it faces away from the road. The 17th century vernacular buildings didn't do that. If they were houses, the house faced onto the road with it usually either a short path or almost no garden in front. If it was a barn, it either faced directly onto the road, so cattle and farm equipment could go in and out easily, or if it was a field barn, it faced onto a level field. This meeting house does neither of those. And I'm not showing you a slide of it because it's rather boring, but the other side of the building, the side facing the road, was totally blank until the very end of the 17th century, when a minuscule little window was put high up in it. Now, you can also see from this slide that the entrance to the building is on the side. It's a rather narrow entrance. The hillside was cut away to make that entrance. I think you can see that the doorway is lower than the retaining wall that holds the cut hillside there. So a lot of effort went into putting the door on the wrong face. In other words, to conceal the door. And in fact, the gateway that you can see there, which is contemporary with the building, is rabbeted, which means, it's cut to take a full height wooden door. So as it was built, if people went in and closed the door, nobody from outside would see what was going on. Clearly, this was not a building for livestock or for farm equipment. It was not a barn, it was not a house. It appears to have been a clandestine, a hidden meeting place for assemblies of more than 100 people. It's known in previous centuries to have accommodated about 120. There's a lot more about this particular building in one of the books that's on sale there, and I do hope you'll buy copies because the money from it helps to preserve the building. But the question that we want to look at tonight is, so who met here? If it was a clandestine meeting, who was meeting? And to answer this question, I want us to start well back in history. The Romans, when they came here, encountered a very sparse Iron Age population in scattered homesteads. These were self-sufficient farmers, not needing much contact with the rest of the world. Very small homesteads, occasionally a cluster, but nothing as big as a village. They were not part of any bigger political organization either. If they were at all tied up with the Briganti, who were further to the east, they were on the very fringe, and we don't have anything definite on that. But one can suspect that they were either elusive or unwelcoming to the Romans, and the reason we suspect that is because who would want foreigners coming in and saying, we own the land, we're going to tax you? Obviously, this would not have been appreciated. The Romans built what are called forts, one, Elsac, a few miles west of Skipton, and the other, Olicana, in Ilkley. Now, these were not highly defensible positions. It's probably wrong to call them forts. Camps would be better. This on the picture is the approximate site of Elsac, the one that's west of Skipton. And as you can see, it's not very raised ground. People could come at it from any direction, and even if it had a palisade around it, it wouldn't amount to much. The Romans were not threatened by the local populace. I think it was really a case of keeping apart. And there was, by the way, a late Roman villa at Gargrave, but that was only one, and it was late. The area was unattractive for Roman exploitation. It didn't have, for instance, the lead mines that were up at Greenhow. And the there was no immediate source of wealth that could be taxed or exploited. It wasn't good enough farmland. So the Romans were just there. They didn't have much effect on the people. But after the Romans left, Angles came in. People from, we call them Angles, people generally from the north of England, of Europe. And these people were not mass invaders. They were pioneers who came in ones and twos and small families. They trickled in or they seeped in, just a bit like migrants do around the world today in various places. Forget about some of the organized ones, but it's mostly trickling in over the centuries. So the existing population was not displaced. It was amalgamated, it was absorbed. The new people coming in had economies that were pretty much similar to what was already there. They set up their homesteads on the large amount of previously unoccupied land. Again, they were self-reliant, moderate comfort, but not wealthy. Their settlements were more clustered than had been previously. Perhaps there were some small villages. They raised oats, they plowed with oxen, they kept some sheep. They were largely or entirely self-governing, self-contained, remote from wider politics. So much so that historians debate and disagree as to whether there ever was a post-Roman kingdom of Craven. If there was such, it's disappeared from history. It's left no mark. And Northumbria at that point did not extend westward into the Pennines. This was still an isolated area, minding its own business and getting on very well, thank you. But I'm going to read to you now a quotation taken from a translation of the Venerable Bede, writing in 731, when he's describing the people who lived westwards outside of beyond Northumbria. And he says, "The Irish who live in Britain are content with their own territories and devise no plots or treachery against the English. Though for the most part the Britons oppose the English through their inbred hatred and the whole state of the Catholic Church by their incorrect Easter and their evil customs, yet being opposed by the power of God and man alike, they cannot obtain what they want in either respect. For although they are partly their own masters, yet they have also been partly brought under the rule of the English." So our people in our area were still mainly pagan or indifferent to religion, and as Bede implies, they remained stubbornly independent. Now, there's another rather beautiful quote. This comes from the great poem Beowulf, which is either of the 8th or the 9th century. It's a bit indistinct. It describes the wilderness home of the monster Grendel. And it says of it, it was a place of steep rocky screes, narrow paths, and ways constricted to a single file, an unknown road, precipitous crags and many water monsters' lairs, a wood devoid of any pleasant aspect, overhanging a gray rock, water standing below, a little-known country, wolf slopes, wind-swept headlands, perilous paths across boggy moors, where a mountain stream plunges under the mist-covered cliffs, rushes through a fissure, a wood firmly rooted frowns over the water. Well, that sounds very much like somebody who was afraid of it, had been in our part of the world and perhaps seen the Strid at Bolton Priory or some of the moorland before and the valley bottoms before they were drained and before the forests were cut down. it sounds like a good description of much of the North Pennines by people who were unused to it and even afraid of it. So at that point, we still have our area being isolated from the wider world. This is a Saxon cross. It has nothing directly to do with our area, but it's of interest because it was found buried in a Viking hoard near Kirkcudbright in Galloway. And this shows you the enormous range that the Vikings had when they came. They swept almost the whole country, from southern England in the Saxon areas up all the way into Galloway. Now, when the Vikings started coming, Northumbrians began fleeing, particularly from the coast, and many of them came westwards. And this caused Christianity to be strengthened in our area. There was Christianity already, but it was a minor thing. It became much more important because monks and various people were fleeing into our area and bringing their religion with them. But the Danes and the Norse also came and settled in our area in fairly large numbers. But once again, there was an awful lot of vacant land, and they did not replace the existing population. Nobody was displaced. The Danes and the Norse, as it were, infilled the lands which had not been previously settled. So there was a gradual infilling of the remaining wilderness areas, and present-day settlement patterns were established. These tended to be in small villages and definitely clustered settlements. They were tight-knit communities, and one of the things that developed out of this was a distinct Anglo-Saxon dialect. Probably in the Pennines, in different areas, there were several dialects, but certainly in our area, seems to have been a dialect. And things stayed a pretty calm development as far as we know. At least nothing else has happened in history that's been noteworthy until the Norman conquest in 1066. I have circled on this map in green the area we're interested in. I'll explain the map in a minute. But the Norman conquest, 1066. The Northumbrian rebellion was in 1069, and the harrowing of the North in 1069 to 70. That was when the Normans decided that if the North was going to be rebellious, what they were going to do was slaughter and destroy everything in sight. And they had a pretty good go of it. Approximately half of almost 2,000 villages and settlements in Yorkshire were totally destroyed and wiped out. This mainly affected the Vale of York and around Durham, because those were the most populous areas. Those were where the settlement had been stronger. That's where the best farmland was in the most coveted areas. But an interesting thing happened. In the lowland areas, the good farm areas, they were repopulated within 2 generations. That's much faster than you would get if it were just by normal growth of a very, very depleted population. It would, if there hadn't been migration in. So what several authors have assumed, and sounds logical to me, is that there was movement from the Pennines, from our area, eastwards into the Vale of York. This had several consequences. One is that it increased trans-Pennine contact. For the first time, our area became more tied in with other parts. There were family contacts, family ties. It may have begun the process which has goes on today still, of people grazing sheep on the highlands in the summer and taking them into the Vale of York for winter grazing. It would have started in a small way, but it could have started then because of the families. Now, one thing I'm pretty sure of is that this would have relieved the growing pressure on the land in our area if families and younger generations were being siphoned off. And this could have been one of delayed the growth of villages into towns, and one of the reasons why our defined area is more characterized by small settlements, small villages, and still dispersed farmsteads. The other thing it must have done is contributed to the local mistrust of external authority. If there was a tendency to not like foreigners anyway, and then you had the resentment because of the results of the harrowing of the North. So this map is the Doomsday Survey. It shows South Craven, all the spots, the villes, which means a village or a hamlet or an isolated settlement, as the case may be, mentioned in the Doomsday Survey in South Craven. Each dot is one vill. Mostly these were family-sized land holdings, few larger holdings, little hierarchy of wealth or of status. But notice already an isolated cluster around Scothrup and Ayrton. The Doomsday Survey says in it which villas were taxable and which ones were waste. In other words, nobody was living in them or they were destroyed. Every vill in Malhamdale, with the exception of the few in Ayrton and Scothrup, were marked as waste. At this distance, we don't know whether they were genuinely depopulated or whether people were very clever at avoiding tax. It could be a bit of both. Now, the Normans, of course, apportioned the whole of what they had conquered to various of their own people, and that includes our area, was given over to a couple of nobles, or people who became nobles. But they didn't much like it and didn't much want it. The peasantry were poor, they were intractable, and furthermore, their language was incomprehensible. And there was little or no surplus wealth to exploit, and the area was remote from the sources of influence, political power, prestige, same as some people recognize it is now. So by the 12th century, most of the land had been given or sold to various monasteries, the larger portion to Bolton Priory and Fountains Abbey, but also to Furness and Dereham. But the existing farmers were left largely undisturbed. They now paid feudal dues and tithes to religious houses, and feudalism was not entirely a bad thing. It was a form of sharecropping, and sharecropping meant shared risks. Just as the farmers cared for their cattle, the overlords, in this case the monastic houses, cared for their people, their peasants, because if they didn't have the people to farm the land, there would be no income. The people were a valued resource, the land was plentiful, and the land was useless if there weren't the farmers. So as a matter of self-interest, as well as a matter of morality, the monasteries did provide a reasonable modicum of poor relief, particularly if crops failed one year, they would provide the seed corn for the next year. They also provided health care, and they provided education, particularly for the younger, the boys and the younger men. The more intelligent and the more restless ones were taken into the monastic houses for education, not necessarily to become monks or lay brothers, but to become civil administrators in many cases. So it was a pretty stable system, and it worked pretty well. People got used to it and they liked it. And this was the medieval warm period by now. We're into the 13th century. So there was a mixed subsistence farming, oats, sheep, cattle, ox plows still. Some wheat was raised near Skipton, and as I suppose most of you have seen, there were ploughlands up near Malham and Goredale Scar, which is far higher up than such farming could be done nowadays. It was a warmer climate than now. And besides the people who were farming, there were smiths and weavers and thatchers, masons, petty traders, a lot of the small industries or cottage crafts that one thinks of as typical of the Middle Ages. So it was beginning to be a mixed economy, and it was pretty well balanced. Close to Bolton Priory, lay brothers directly farmed the land around MC and East Bay, and the lay brothers plus hired agents raised sheep on the uplands, and the sheep raising was on a vast scale with tie-ins to the international wool trade on a big scale. So there was a great beginning of an opening up of some literacy, a greater awareness of the world at large. And as I said, this was a period of social and economic stability until multiple disasters struck, and they struck in a big way. The early 14th century was the start to the Little Ice Age. Between 1308 and 1310, harvests were very, very poor. 1315 was known as the year when there was no summer, and 1316 is the year when it didn't stop raining. So, for this period of 8 or 9 years, there were no harvests, there were no grazing. The stored grain was exhausted or rotted. There was famine, diseases of people, diseases of animals, and worse was to come. This is a map of the Scottish raids, which again I'll explain in a moment. The Pict and the Scots raiders had laid waste of much of Craven as early as 1138, but then for the next 2 centuries, raids were small and sporadic, and they, particularly viewed from Scotland, they have a rather romantic look to them, which probably is unjustified, but you know, I mean, it's like land pirates. But then was the Anglo-Scottish War that started in 1318, and in 1318, 1319, and almost every year thereafter to 1327, there was military invasion. This was not romantic raiders. This was hundreds or thousands of mounted troops coming, raiding, sweeping down the Vale of York, and you can follow it from the dots here, along the River Wharfe, through the Air Gap, up the River Wenning, into Lancaster, and then north through Lancaster. On their way, they seized cattle, livestock. They were particularly interested in seizing iron and metals and foodstuffs and slaves. They took everything they could get. It was really, really bad. Now, the dots show the settlements that had been reassessed after the raids to pay reduced taxes and or church fees. Where there are no dots, it's because there were no viable farms or inhabitants. In Malhamdale, the population was reduced by more than 50%. It was really bad. And it was followed by the Black Death, 1348, and periodically thereafter. The Black Death was worst in the densely settled areas, York and so forth, but it didn't leave our area alone at all. The result of all these calamities, it was a total collapse of the feudal system. Bolton Priory, which had been so very, very wealthy, was totally bankrupt. Its farms were unoccupied, so there was no tithes and no rents coming in. The monks had to be dispersed, sent away to monasteries in other parts of England because there was no food for them. And administrators were installed, which led to a major reorganization of the land structure. The farms near Bolton were not revived at all. And so instead of farming the land, the lay brothers turned them into vacuaries where they raised oxen mainly, but also some sheep, because it was much less labor intensive. The relatively few surviving farms in our three dales were put onto fixed rate tenancies instead of sharecropping. And that meant that if a farmer could make, whether he made a large profit one year or not, he had to pay the same amount to the priory. So it was less convenient, but it kind of worked out. The uplands, the vast sheep raising areas, were let out to tenants on big scale, and the tenants then subtenanted the land. For instance, on Malham and Malham Moor, 12 tenancies were established in the year 1322. This would have been a few big landholders, and then they're subdividing it. Mostly it was the previous monastic agents who became the new landlords. And throughout all this, the monasteries continued providing social services and cultural stability, because after all, they wanted their rents coming in, so they still had to do what they could to support the population. The 14th century was in fact a time of a European-wide preoccupation with death and purgatory, because of course the climate effects and the Black Death was all over Europe. On the continent, this led to church building and enlargement that was paid for by the sale of indulgences, which Martin Luther protested against, and eventually led to the Protestant Reformation. In the wealthy parts of England, it resulted in the establishment of redundantly furnished and overstaffed chantries, that is, little chapels within existing large and big churches. And these had, in some cases, great numbers of gilt and silver candlesticks and church furniture and one thing and another, and jeweled crosses, and you can imagine the sorts of things, and probably you've seen some examples, which attracted the attention of Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell when they were looking for new sources of funding. In our area, which was not so wealthy, where parishes were large and churches were different, it led to something different. It led to the local foundation of very tiny, usually just one-room, thatch-roofed chapels, founded and established by the people who lived in the area, and these people also appointed the priest and saw to the priest's maintenance. So the priests were appointed and supported by local people. Very often these priests, these local priests, served as school teachers, as will scribes, and they were a focus of community life and moral authority. And people really valued them because, you know, they appointed who they wanted, and it worked very well. Now, for example, in Malham Church itself, 3 chantries were established because that was a fairly wealthy church, and they went there. But there were also chapels, these small rural chapels established at waterhouses on Malham Moor, in Ayrton, in Malham, in Hanleith, in Winterburn, in Bordley, in Helton Gill, Hellifield, Flasby, Settle, and so forth. I've just given you the ones in that area so you could have a feel for how many and how close together they were. So there continued to be a cultural or reestablished a cultural and economic stability in the 15th century, and that lasted for not quite 200 years, 150 years. And then came the dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541. And I'll just give you the dates of some of the other things. The Chantry Acts of 1545 and 1547, the Act of Uniformity of 1559, and the 13 Articles of 1563. All these were geared to destroying the existing church structure and replacing it. Vast monastic lands were confiscated and sold to profit-seeking, mostly non-local landlords who were trying to get back the investment that they'd paid because they had bought the lands from the king or from the crown, and they were trying to get their investment back. So there were a lot of rent increases, and there was a lot of population displacement. But worse than that, the traditional cultural and economic base of rural life was destroyed. It was very thoroughly destroyed. So there was much hardship, and the social support systems that the monasteries provided were not replaced. So now you had people who were poor, who'd been in many cases turned off their land because they couldn't pay the increased rent, and they had nowhere to turn to. The future Major General Lambert, his great-grandfather was one of the few people locally who profited by this system. He managed to acquire a family estate that went on for some time. But one of the other effects of the dissolution of the monasteries was there were about 700 Yorkshire-born and bred monks and a few lay brothers, because by then the lay brother system had deteriorated, who were turned out of their monasteries and went back into the communities in Yorkshire. And there were probably a similar number of their employees and pensioners and other people who'd been very closely associated with monasteries, all went back into the rural communities they'd come from. So the effect of this, far from destroying traditional Catholicism, was to strengthen the determination to maintain traditional religion. And this was supported by many of the local gentry and the yeomen, the people who were the thought leaders in the time and place. And some of these, for instance, are Christopher Martin of Eshton, Richard Whitfield and Thomas Proctor of Winterburn, John Proctor of Bordley, and very, very many more. So the next thing that happened in 1536 to 7 was the Pilgrimage of Grace, and many people have heard of this. It was opposed to the dissolution of monasteries, and it involved about 40,000 people. Many of them came from Craven. Its leaders included the Earls of Northumberland and the Earl of Westmoreland, and also, for instance, Robert Aske of Malhamdale. Now, lots of people have heard of the Pilgrimage of Grace without knowing what it is. It was a lot of noise and banners and badges and rather chaotic marching about. It was nonviolent, but it appeared very menacing to vested interests. These people were protesting real grievances. There was economic hardship, there was moral outrage, and there was the assertion of a local identity that they felt was being taken away from them. If you can imagine, I think many of you are as old as I am and can remember the miners' strikes, the CND marches, and the Orange Parade, and combine the three of them, the combination of economic protest and moral rectitude and self-assertion. Well, the leaders of the Pilgrimage of Grace were bribed and bought off. It was a little bit complicated, but that's essentially what happened. And things were quiet until 1569, when there was the rising of the North, which was essentially the same thing all over again, except that it was almost entirely involving people from Craven. And Craven was effectively the South Craven, the North Craven was less densely populated. One example, for instance, is Leonard Metcalfe of Kirby Malham. He was a major landholder, and he had superior tenants under him, and his tenants still owed him the feudal duty of following him into battle. So he led his tenants on the rising of the North. And included in this were members of the Sargent family and the Lawson family, and those were both, again, fairly major landholding farming families. The government suppressed the rising of the North very, very stringently, and it imposed harsh penalties on anyone who had been involved with it. Most of the leaders were killed, and 1 in 10 of those who had participated in it were condemned to death. That's a big number of people. Later, most of them were reprieved, but in each area, each little sort of center, one prominent person was picked out and forced to publicly hang another one of the prominent participants. So William Lawson was forced to hang his neighbor, William Sargentson. Well, you can imagine that didn't do much to make people very pleased with the government. The sense of antipathy and grievance of national authorities was certainly reinforced. Other plots went on as the last one to take place, was the Farnley Wood plot in 1663 near Otley, but that's getting a little bit out of our area, so I'm going to skip over it. But the effect of all this is that by the late 16th century, many of the local landowners and magistrates were still Catholics. But it was illegal, so some sort of pretended to conform. They would go to church once or twice a year if anybody was looking, but then they would kindly slip out before the sacrament was celebrated. And these people were the magistrates as well as the larger landowners. They couldn't openly support Catholicism, so they supported religious tolerance. And the effect of this was that there was a lot of interest in religion, because with the toleration and all the things that were going on, it was what people talked about. The authorities feared that if they suppressed it entirely, they'd have to get rid of the magistrates, they had no one to replace them, and the North would have become totally lawless. Well, that didn't seem like a very good idea. So instead, they started appointing Cambridge-trained reformist preachers, because these were eloquent men, well-trained, and these men opposed both Catholic ritual and Puritan formalism. But of course, they themselves were veering towards very radical forms of unorthodoxy. And some of these people were actually very influential in our area. I'll mention Christopher Shute, who was preacher and schoolmaster at Giggleswick from 1575 to 1626. Nicholas Walton, who was at Kirby Malham from 1626 to 1666. And he was schoolmaster to the young John Lambert, who became as an adult, Major General Lambert and number 2 to Cromwell. There was also Robert Moore, who started out as the chaplain at Skipton Castle, but then became the vicar of Gisborne in 1581. And Roger Brearley, who became a leading Grindletonian at Brindleton Church, of course, and at least a dozen others. These were all very eloquent preachers, very, very convincing and thoughtful. Clergy and laity at this period traveled around to attend this inspired preaching. It was the form of entertainment of the time, with no televisions and no videos and so forth and so on. If you wanted some new intellectual input, you went and heard a sermon by one of these dramatic Cambridge people. And so a church visitation in 1619 said of not many people at church because many go to Grindleton and neglect their own parish church. Well, Grindleton, as I mentioned, was where Robert Brearley was preaching. And in fact, between 1615 and 1635, in other words, the first third of the 17th century, church visitations cited the priests Richard Tennant, Thomas Armstrong, Nicholas Walton, William Boyes, Roger Brearley, John Webster, and others for such terrible things, doctrinal heterodoxy, unauthorized preaching elsewhere than in their own church, not wearing a surplice, permitting lay people to preach and to pray aloud in their churches, and not using the sign of the cross in baptism. So there was the basic question that was going on at this time was how are religious truths known and how are they transmitted? The people who depended on tradition and valued tradition more than anything else remained Roman Catholics. Only now they were illegal and they were called recusants. They hadn't changed, but the world had changed around them. The people who depended on whatever was the state legislation went along with the state-sanctioned established church, and they were at times lampooned with the Song of the Vicar of Bray. The people who depended on the Bible and tried to follow a literal interpretation of the Bible were the Puritans. And the problem they had was everybody had a different idea of what was literal in the Bible, but that's a problem. But there was another group, and these were the people who valued individual personal experience and their own intuition above anything else. And these generally go under the heading of antinomians. That means without the law. They didn't have a law that fit for everybody. They said people had to find their own way into religion. Now, the antinomians were of two sorts. Some remained in the established church, admittedly on the fringe of it and with a certain amount of friction. And these were the Grindletonians. They were locally numerous. They were led by Roger Brearley and Robert Moore, who I mentioned a little bit ago, and they were particularly numerous in Grindleton, in Kildwick, and in Gisborne and areas round about. The other group did not remain in the church. They felt that all present-day churches were corrupt. These were called the Seekers. Sometimes they identified themselves as seekers, sometimes they just kept quiet, but they were locally numerous. And they are very, very difficult to research because apparently they were deliberately elusive. They just would not call attention to themselves. They seem not to have kept any records and not to have had any publicly recognized meeting places. But we have hints that they did have an organizational structure. From diaries and records of other people, we know that their leaders met at the home of Gervase Benson in Brigg Flats in June 1652. And this was the prelude to a large seeker gathering held at the Midsummer Fair in Sedberg that year. And we know that seeker gathering was attended by a woman of the name of Margaret Fell. She lived in Ulverston, 40 miles away. Clearly, the seekers had ways of communicating and letting know, not only to gather a big group at Sedberg, but to gather people from some distance. And incidentally, Margaret Fell was the wife of a magistrate, Judge Fell. We also know that Thomas Taylor, who farmed land at Carleton, just outside of Skipton, was reputed to be president of the Seekers, and his brother, Christopher Taylor, was leader of the Westmoreland Seekers. The Tennant family, who farmed at Scar House in Hubberholm, set aside part of their land as a Seeker burial plot. That subsequently became a Quaker burial plot, and if you go up there, you'll find a little sign to it. They were a large, well-connected family. They also owned land in Skipton. The Watkinson family, who farmed at Rilston and also had farmland at Lower Bradley, and several brothers, they were also known to be Seekers. So we have hints that the Seekers were organized, they were communicating with each other, but we don't know a lot about them. The mid-17th century had a very febrile sort of atmosphere. Religion and politics were much the same thing. At least hundreds, and perhaps thousands in our area, were antinomians. They favored spirit-led religion, they mistrusted the established church and its legal enforcements. They opposed very vehemently money-grubbing tithes. I mean, who wouldn't? You'd rather keep your produce for yourself. They rejected church rituals, church hierarchies. We know that they met and worshipped in unprogrammed silent meetings, and they were much given to extempore sermons and discussions. And they waited for God to send them a new prophet. They refused to establish a church because they were waiting for their prophet. Now, into this atmosphere, in the summer of 1652, in walked two Quaker leaders, preachers, George Fox and Richard Farnsworth. And we know from Quaker records that they were walking on foot. They started near Bradford. They went to Pendle Hill, they went to Hubberholm, and they went to Sedberg. So on this map, I've reconstructed the probable routes using the roads as they ran. To get from Bradford to Pendle Hill, and probably, in fact, they were going to Grindleton to see the Grindletonians, they must have gone by Skipton. That's the way the roads went. And then to get from Pendle Hill to Hubberholm, the easiest walking route is by way of Ayrton. And incidentally, Major General Lambert was probably at home in his home in Calton, next door to Ayrton then, and that would have been a nice thing if they could have convinced Lambert to become a Quaker. The map also shows the names of some of the liberal and radical leaders they may have sought out because their intention was to visit and convince or convert or enlist like-minded people. Now, these two Quaker preachers would have known in advance of the Seekers and the Grindletonians, and vice versa. Their message that religion is a first-hand, direct, personal experience openly reinforced what was being thought and practiced in private. And George Fox himself was energetic, enthusiastic, 28 years old. I mean, that's a really appealing age. He was inspired, he was inspiring, and he may well have been perceived by some or perhaps most of the Seekers as the prophet they were waiting for. So he would have met Seeker leaders in Skipton before he walked on to Grindleton and Pendle Hill, and we know he had to have met them there because when he got to Sedberg, he was invited to attend this private meeting of the Seeker leaders. He didn't turn up by accident, even though in his own writings he tries to make it appear that he did. It wouldn't have worked that way. He preached at Sedberg at this midsummer gathering in 1652, and very many of the Seekers and some of the Grindletonians almost immediately became Quakers. So now we can go back to where we started from. I've given you a 19th century drawing of the meeting house for a change. The meeting house, we know from other sources, it's in the book, was constructed early in the 17th century. It seems to have been purpose-built as a concealed meeting place. It is very close to the Lambert family home in Calton, less than 2 miles away, and it's within sight, just in the adjacent field, to what had been their dower house in Ayrton. It was most probably built by Josias Lambert, who was the father of Major General, and it would have to have been built before 1621, which is about when Josias Lambert more or less bankrupted the family. It seemed most likely it was built as a place for seeker meetings for worship, because we know they were meeting somewhere in silence, and there is no record of them having met in Skipton or anywhere else more prominent. The Major General Lambert, who, as I remind you, had had his earliest education from the radical priest Nicholas Walton, subsequently owned the Ayrton Meeting House, which was in regular use by Quakers by the mid-1650s, possibly from as early as 1653 or 1654, but certainly by 1658. And it was continued to be owned by Major General Lambert and then his son until 1700, when it was built, when it was bought by Quakers. In other words, the Lambert family was not opposed to Quakerism, and possibly they were, in a quiet way, giving it quite a lot of support. So, what we can say about the meeting house is that it is one of the oldest dissenter meeting places in Britain, probably originally for seekers, but it remains in Quaker use for meetings for worship, as it has been since the 1650s, and visitors are welcome, and there's more information in the books. And thank you very much.